adjusting the webcam here. Okay, I thought I'd address the claims of the Muslim community, because being in chat rooms or on YouTube and so forth, and I'll address some claims of Christians too. Basically, I'll just address the claims of Abrahamic faiths when they try to convert individuals to their cults. You encounter a lot of very highly active, highly religious Muslims and Christians anywhere you go online, especially if you hang around religious forums or chat rooms. They're all inundated with atheists, pagans, Satanists, Muslims, Christians, each trying to push their own faith. And they do so in different ways. Of course, the atheists and Satanists and so forth, they appeal to logic, they tell people there's no evidence of God and so forth. The Muslims and Christians in particular, and some Jews, but very few of them because they don't have as large a presence online, they push their faith by making fantastic claims as to the divine nature of their religions and as to the technological nature of their history. That is, that Muslims will tell you, and I'll address a few claims here. Well, the Quran said the world was round, so that gives our religion credence. Well, there are two problems with this. The verse which they cite in the Quran, which claims the world is round, is speaking of round as a flat circle, which is the notion that the Christians at the time had as well, and the Bible says the same thing, that the world is circular. This implies a flat, circular plane, or perhaps a dome, in a two-dimensional form. Of course, the Bible says the winds are at the four corners of the earth, literally being held back by God. The Quran claims much the same thing, because the Quran is essentially a partially plagiarized version of the Bible and a revisionist view of Christianity and Judaism. Claims to be original and God-inspired, but it's actually not. There is no verse in the Bible or Quran that states that the earth is a sphere. The Bible says that it's essentially a flat circle suspended by a string in the heavens. The Quran states that it's essentially a flat circle, but they did add that it rotates, so they got something right there. The problem being, of course, a circle is not a three-dimensional form, it's a two-dimensional form and is flat. The Muslims, I've seen them claim that there are scientific miracles in the Quran, certain numbers adding up, certain prophecies about black holes, about the size and shape of the universe, about galaxy structures, and they make the fantastic claim that more and more scientists are legitimizing, especially they note some obscure study in embryology and claim that it's similar to the Quran. When they do this, simply ask them where their sources come from. They cannot cite the source, because these claims are spread word of mouth on Muslim forums and chat rooms, and simply one fundamentalist Muslim will note something on a conspiracy forum, tell it to all of their friends, and it spreads like wildfire throughout the fundamentalist Muslim community. The same thing happens with Christians. When I pointed out the Sounds of Hell recording by Art Bell was a fraud, and criticized it and pointed out the actual origin of that tape, the Christians went into an uproar because they spread it word of mouth. First it spread from Russia to a Finnish fundamentalist group through a newsletter which had a circulation of about 100 people. It was then seized upon by TBN for a scary story about hell, and of course the recording was altered and played on air, and then Art Bell got a hold of it from a conspiracy buff who, of course, had a religious motive. These theories spread word of mouth. They aren't actually substantiated by any legitimate scientific or educational sources. They simply spread word of mouth. They're invented, and they spread from person to person. It's an oral tradition. Recently, there have been more and more Christians popping up on forums and chat rooms claiming that Nephilim, which are the giants, of course, which are supposed to have occurred in biblical times when angels came down and had sex with human women, and they spawned giants, which were then killed off by man, that skeletons of these giants are being discovered and then spirited off to museums by people who don't want the story going public. Of course, there's no adequate, legitimate scientific or educational source for these. The only source are conspiracy videos on YouTube, which show these fantastic-looking skeletons, which all use the same footage of one skeleton. There aren't multiple digs or anything. And in fact, these skeletons are actually man-made, manufactured objects, which have no actual legitimate history behind them. They're essentially the same as the supposed giant skeleton we all remember from, I believe it was the 20s, which turned out to simply be a chunk of rock which had been etched with acid. There's no real legitimate substantiated story behind it. The fact is that when you can't push your religion on people by appealing to their emotion, in this modern age of science and technology, the fundamentalists find it more appropriate to simply spit out these vague statistics and ideas from pseudo-scientific sources which don't actually back up their stories. The same happens every 10 years or so. Some religiously motivated group goes up on Mount Ararat, brings down a piece of old wood, and claims that it's part of Noah's Ark. They've never actually proven that there's anything up there. Satellite imagery shows nothing. They point out this boat-looking crater. It's been investigated. It's just a crater. There's nothing else there. But the religious people will still, to this day, claim that it's Noah's Ark. They point to all of these little findings of decomposed wood up there, which are carbon dated and revealed to be much younger than Noah's Ark would have been. And they overlook the fact that even if a Noah's Ark did land on Mount Ararat, it would be a pile of dust by now. Again, these groups will go forth and they will claim, oh, well, look at all the technology, and this is Muslims in particular. Look at all the technology Muslims have. Arabic numerals and Aristotle's science and chemistry and all these things that were, the Christian world was in the Dark Ages and Muslims were inventing all these things. No, they didn't invent them. Pagans invented them hundreds of years before Islam ever existed. It was rediscovered by people who coincidentally happened to be Muslims because they were living in the geographic area where the pagans invented these things in the first place. Flamethrower, Greek. Hand grenades, Greek. Machine guns, essentially the first machine guns, Roman. These things were invented by pagan cultures, adapted by Islamic or Christian cultures, and then claimed retroactively in the modern age by Christians in Rome and Muslims as Christian or Muslim inventions. Arabic numerals. They were already developed long before Islam existed. The only thing that the Muslims did was add 0 to the equation. All the other numbers were already there. The number system, everything was there. They simply invented the concept of 0. Ironically, pagans living in the Maya Empire did the same thing hundreds of years before Islam existed, completely separate from any of the Western, so-called Western religions. I guess you would call them Eastern religions because they were east of the Mayan Empire, but you know what I mean. The fact is that the Muslim and Christian claims to all of this miraculous technology and miraculous revelations from their books are false. Do not let yourself be confused into thinking that the Quran invented the notion that the world was round, because even if you took it at face value and assumed that their claims that the Quran said that were true, which they aren't, it was already developed by pagans hundreds of years before. In fact, in this case, more than 1,000 years before. 1,500 years before Islam existed, pagans invented the concept that the world was round. Not an original idea by far. It was invented by the Greek pagans. So all of these astrologically significant phenomenon, calendars, and things in mathematics and science, they were all invented by pagans. I've got several documentaries on the history from the History Channel loaded onto my YouTube account here that quite accurately reflect that all of these things, steam engines and siege towers, things that were used in the Renaissance and medieval days, were invented by the pagans over 1,000 years before the Muslims or Christians had access to them. In fact, the technology of the Muslims and Christians during the Dark Ages and Renaissance were piddling compared to the technology that the Romans or Greeks possessed. If the Romans suddenly had been reincarnated from the grave, had access to all the technology and infrastructure which they had originally, they could have steamrolled Dark Age Christians and Muslims easily. They would have possessed technology that would have seemed divine and miraculous to people living over 1,000 years later, simply by virtue of the fact that during that period of time, they were rediscovering old technology and readapting it, yes, but they weren't inventing that much new technology. The Dark Ages very much were dark. And the Muslims claiming it wasn't dark for the Muslims, we had plumbing and we had, Aristotle. It was still dark for them too. They suffered with the plague, they went into regression. Only by virtue of chance did they happen to inhabit the same geographic area that gave them access to the old ruins and archives which they dug up, and gave them access to this old technology that the pagans had long before they existed. So the claims of Muslims and Christians to have access to all of this new technology is actually in reality a claim to technology that they probably should have thought of on their own 1,000 years before they, developed the same technology the pagans left them in their archaeological excavation sites. And even to this day, we're finding more and more strange objects from the Greco-Roman part of the world. They found something that apparently was a wristwatch that the Romans had invented. That didn't exist in the Dark Ages. Clockworks simply didn't exist then. All of these wonderful things, I wouldn't be surprised if they unearthed rockets that the Romans had created. And if you look at the Atlantis myth, if you take that at face value and assume that Santorini is Atlantis and that an explosion simply destroyed all their technology, look at what the Mexicans were making in pagan times. They had, irrigation canals and modern plumbing, and they made terraforming on a mass scale. The people inhabiting the Caribbean were making, these somewhat primitive but still impressive mound structures. Hybridization of crops wasn't invented by the Muslims or Christians either. All of these innovations that we think of as, singular to these Christian and Muslim groups are actually long predating these religions. And anyway, even if you gave them face value, again, even if you take these claims at face value and you say, oh, well, okay, well then I guess the Christians and Muslims invented all these wonderful things, still doesn't matter. Guess why? Their religion had nothing to do with those inventions. In fact, many of the great inventions of the Renaissance by Christians were done in lieu of approval by the Catholic Church. That is to say that the Church attempted to stop most technological progression during the Renaissance era, and it was only by willful and deliberate ignorance of the Church laws and threat of excommunication that anyone developed anything during that period of time. The Church was still very much in control. The same can be said for the Islamic world. What few new inventions have come out of the Islamic world in the last 1,000 years, well, not 1,000 years, but almost 1,000 years, what few technological progressions have been made in those cultures have come not because of Islam, but in spite of the existence of Islam, because such technology can be said to be frowned upon in certain religious groups. You don't have that problem with the pagans. The pagans said, whatever works to get rid of these other pagan heathen groups, just do it. So they didn't have any problem with the new technology. Christianity and Islam deliberately stand in the way of new technology when it goes against their religious beliefs. Of course, the Greco-Roman pagans didn't care. They didn't care what you invented for new military technology. It kills the heathens off. They didn't care about new agricultural technology. Oh, we'll just have more stuff to offer to the gods for sacrifice. It's wonderful. So the pagans invented most of the things and ideas and concepts which the Muslims and Christians take credit for, so don't let them fool you. They're nothing special and they're nothing revolutionary. It's simply not the case. Arabic numerals, flamethrowers, Earth as not the center of the universe. No, these things were done in spite of Christianity and Islam, not because of them. The fact that some of the people that did invent these things happen to be Christian or Muslim has little bearing when you realize most of these people were only Christian or Muslim because their parents were, and they more or less ignored the clergy that was involved in the tyrannical, theocratic rule of those periods of time. So that's just a little expose on the claims that Christians and Muslims make. They're not quite what they seem. Don't take them at face value. Peace out.